This is part 1 of the HIS 122 Test 1 review. The first part of this review covers Chapter 17. Question number 1 was, what was meant by the term manifest destiny? This is the idea that the United States was ordained to spread from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific Ocean. This idea became much more likely after the United States defeated Mexico in the Mexican War in 1848, and based on the terms of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which provided America, the United States, lots of territory that was previously part of Mexico, including much of the current southwest United States stretching from Texas through Arizona, and then California, of course, was also secured by the United States in this treaty. So that made it much more likely that the U.S. would, in fact, stretch from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. And we get into question number 2. What did the federal government do to incentivize westward migration? There are some laws passed that make this transcontinental expansion of the United States much more likely. The first law that was passed was in 1862 and was the Homestead Act, which basically ensured that anyone who was the head of a household could secure up to 160 acres. All they had to do was pay a filing fee, so over 270 million acres of public land was transferred to private individuals based on this Homestead Act. And then the other law that was passed was the Pacific Railway Act, which incentivized the formation of a large number of railroad companies that were basically given land in order to build segments of track that would help lead to a rail system that would spread all the way across the country. Some of those companies were not genuine, real companies, and so there was a lot of fraudulent land acquisitions during this time period by people who said they were going to build railroads but had no intent, and just got away with it because there was not a lot of enforcement of laws related to the Railway Act. But the positive aspect of it is that the amount of railroad mileage built in the United States expanded exponentially during this time period, and the United States in 1869 did in fact have a transcontinental railroad when the so-called Golden Spike was driven in Promontory Point, Utah. We had a railroad that stretched from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific. Question number 3 has several terms in it. The first term, exodusters, refers to the large group of southern blacks who migrated from the Deep South to the West. Primarily, we use this term to describe those American blacks who lived in Kansas that made their way from the South to farm in the state of Kansas. About 25,000 blacks migrated to Kansas in 1879 and 1880. The term Exodus is a play on the biblical book in the Hebrew Testament of the book of Exodus that refers to the escape of the Jewish people from Egypt. In this case, it was southern blacks who were escaping from the problems they faced in the South to Kansas and dealing with the dusty job of becoming farmers in that state. Buffalo Soldiers refers to a group of black soldiers who served in the U.S. Cavalry during the latter part of the 1800s, were involved in a number of confrontations with American Indians, as those sorts of confrontations were quite frequent in the last 30 or 40 years of the 1800s out west, and became known as for their bravery in providing service to the United States and to settlers on the frontier. The next part of the question is the Comstock Lode. That refers to what was at the time the largest mineral strike, silver strike, in the U.S. and it occurred in the state of Nevada in 1859. It's the reason that Nevada would become a state before the Civil War was out, was because of a large number of people who moved there to try to get wealth from this gold and silver strike known as the Comstock Lode. So it was the largest mineral strike at the time in U.S. history in the state, what would become the state of Nevada. The next term is the Sand Creek Massacre. It also occurred during the Civil War. There's a whole series of confrontations between American Indians and the U.S. military and settlers moving to the west. In this specific case, the Sand Creek Massacre refers to the U.S. cavalry attacking a large number of Cheyenne Indians in Colorado. The U.S. cavalry was under the leadership of John Chivington, and they killed over 400 American Indians, many of whom were the elderly, were women and children. The Indian group had believed they were under the protection of the military. They had signed a treaty. They were peaceful with the U.S. military and U.S. government, but Chivington carried out this really act full of atrocities. There was some other things connected to this that happened, including some of the soldiers who refused to take part in this massacre actually testifying, leading to charges against Chivington, and the leader of that group, Silas Soule, was actually murdered in Denver by someone who was close to Chivington. So the Sand Creek Massacre is a massacre of Cheyenne Indians carried out under the leadership of John Chivington. The Battle of Little Bighorn is quite famous. That was also known as Custer's Last Stand. It occurred in southern Montana near the Little Bighorn River. Custer and all his men were killed by Sioux Indians under the leadership of Sitting Bull. There were other military personnel there that did not get to Custer in time to provide assistance, but that is the famous last stand of Custer, the Battle of Little Bighorn, that occurred in 1876. And finally, the last major confrontation between the American Indians and the U.S. military occurred in South Dakota at Wounded Knee. You may watch the video clip that I posted in Module 1. In that situation, this was towards the end of what was known as the Ghost Dance movement, and essentially it was a large number of mostly unarmed American Indians who were killed there at Wounded Knee. More than 200 Lakota Indian men and women and children were killed there. That was considered the last major confrontation between the United States military and the American Indians. So that would be all the questions that are in Chapter 17. Starting with question 4, we start to deal with Chapter 18. So question 4 is one that we've discussed a lot, and that is what 3 factors led to the Second Industrial Revolution in the United States, and that's answered if you happen to look at the 4th slide of Chapter 18 slides. There were 3 factors that led to the Second Industrial Revolution. First was the creation of an interconnected transportation and communication network. There we're referring to the fact that we now have railroads that stretched across the country, and alongside those railroads would be telegraph lines. So the first reason for the expansion, the first reason for the Second Industrial Revolution, was the creation of interconnected transportation and communication networks. The second reason for the Industrial Revolution in America was the widespread application of electrical power. Electricity became much more common. The way it was generated allowed for factories to be built in more diverse areas. They didn't necessarily have to be along a body of water to have a power source. With the availability of electricity. The final one that we've discussed as well is the application of scientific research to the industrial process. There were a lot of innovative Americans and a lot of individuals from other countries who came to America who were involved in a variety of inventions, and people like the Scotsman Alexander Graham Bell or the American Thomas Edison, who was heavily involved in inventions related to electricity. And so that innovation and those inventions helped lead to the Second Industrial Revolution. Question number 5, what were some of the impacts of the massive growth of railroads from the end of the Civil War until 1900? I suggest that you look at the slides that slide number 15 and slide number 16 in your chapter 18 slides. I list several things there. I'll talk about some of those, but that will provide answers for you. That the development of the railroads led to what we now refer to as modern corporations because of the need for raising capital, money to invest in those. Railroads unified the United States in a physical sense. People were not afraid to travel from the east to the west. More people we'll see actually move because of that, but there's this idea now that the country is truly connected, that there's not a vast gulf of land that's inhospitable that you have to traverse across to get to other sections of the country. Railroads allowed you to do it in a much more quicker fashion than previously. It created the market for manufactured goods that had not existed because you're able to move those goods, and allowed the acquisition of raw materials to be moved from one part of the country to another much more quickly. The extensive use of rails led to massive increases in the growth in the steel industry in America, and we'll talk about Andrew Carnegie later and J.P. Morgan. They both benefited from this. There was more mining and agriculture in the West. As more people moved there, more equipment's moved to the West. It's easier to participate in those activities, and we have a lot of those individuals who are provided land through the Homestead Act. They start to farm that land. And in addition to folks who had moved west earlier, now with the addition of railroads along the railroad lines, you start to see little settlements pop up, including farmers, but also merchants and other businessmen who form these small towns that become fairly sizable as they grow with more and more people using the railroads. It increased migration. In other words, people were much more likely to move around the country. It also increased immigration as we needed people to work on the railroads. Immigration, especially from China and Ireland, as folks come to America to work those jobs. It dramatically affected land as it displaced the bison population. That's going to have a huge impact on American Indians. Time zones were formally created in 1883 to regulate railroad schedules, to have consistent railroad schedules. There's a new degree of wealth in the United States that exists because of people involved in railroad companies, a new rich class of super wealthy people that occurs, much like what technology has done in the 20th and 21st centuries here in America. And of course, improved communications as telegraph lines expanded to follow the railroad tracks. Tourism becomes a thing as people realize they can travel over a period of days instead of months to get to these amazing sites, especially in the West, in places like the Grand Canyon and Yellowstone and Yosemite. It made foods available, certain types of foods that were only available previously in certain seasons, now available all year round because you can have those foods transported from one part of the country to the other. So those were all impacts or effects of railroads on American life. Question number 6 asks you about a series of individuals. Alexander Graham Bell was the inventor and patented the telephone. Telephones grew dramatically by the end of the 1800s. By the time we get to 1900, we had over almost 1.5 million telephones in use in America. Thomas Alva Edison, the most famous American inventor, invented a variety of items, including the phonograph, would be responsible for the new use of film in the film industry, famously invented the light bulb, and one of the more important inventions he had was the storage battery, the ability to have a source of power that was mobile. Andrew Carnegie was from Scotland. He started out as an immigrant working for Pennsylvania Railroad. He recognized in his roles working with the railroad how important steel would be in this coming expansion of railroads, so he then became invested in the steel process and started Carnegie Steel and became one of the wealthiest men in the world because of that. Eventually he would sell that company to J.P. Morgan, who we'll talk about in just a moment. John D. Rockefeller, arguably the wealthiest man in the history of the world, made his wealth through oil production, established Standard Oil, and became synonymous with the concept of wealth. John D. Rockefeller. And then J.P. Morgan, who we just mentioned, was America's great financier, great banker. He was an investment banker. He even provided money to the U.S. government when it was in need with the economic panic of 1893. Eventually, he purchased Carnegie Steel and turned that into the U.S. Steel Corporation. And as I mentioned previously, he at one point controlled over $22 billion in assets, which was more money than all the land west of the Mississippi was worth. So a dominant, wealthy individual in American history. Number 7, what was the gospel of wealth? That refers to the essay that Andrew Carnegie wrote, that he discussed the idea that the wealthy in society had an obligation to make the world better for those around them. And Carnegie did that. He established local library systems around the country. He helped the development of a variety of museums. He created the Carnegie Mellon Institute Educational, which is today a college, an institute of higher education in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, supported a lot of educational endeavors. So that essay that he wrote argued that the wealthy in society had an obligation to help those around them. So really the father of philanthropy. Number 8 is a repeat question. Sorry about that. Let's skip that. That's just number 5. I'll need to remove that. It's just number 5 rephrased. Number 9, what happened in the Haymarket Affair? The Haymarket Affair was a confrontation between workers in the Chicago area and the Chicago police. It happened in a time period where there were increasing tensions between workers and owners of companies. In this case, it was McCormick workers who'd been on strike. There was a large rally in Chicago. This occurred in early May of 1886. The protest was initially peaceful. There were a lot of speakers who talked about the need for workers to unite and to be certain that their rights were protected. But what happens then, someone along the way, and it's not clear who, threw a bomb into a crowd of police officers, and that led to just a clash between the police and these strikers and these groups of anarchists. Anarchists were individuals who believed in the absence of the government was the best way, the best state of society. And in the end, there were several individuals who were arrested, 4 who were executed. A lot of questions about the guilt of those who were actually killed, hanged, because in many respects there was really no evidence they had been involved in the violence in any way, shape, or form. But the Haymarket Affair really hurt organized labor and unions as they were trying to build public support against these large corporations. But the corporations, and really a public relations battle, painted them as all being extremists and anarchists. And one of the many cases in American history where propaganda makes a difference, and it certainly made a difference there and set back the organized labor movement because of that. So that's the end of part 1 of our test review. That covers questions 1 through 9, which cover chapters 17 and 18.